Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for Understanding the State Budget. This is the third in our year-long monthly nonprofit advocacy webinar series. I'm Jeff Narebook from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and I'll be helping to monitor the chat today and just go over a couple of introductory notes. A couple of housekeeping items. You should see a slide on your computer screen with the title of today's webinar. If you don't, or if you have any problems during the webinar, please dial Start Meetings toll-free support line directly for assistance. And if you want to write this number down, it's 1-800-644-9070. And I'll say that one more time. It's 1-800-644-9070. And that number is also listed in the instructional email that I sent out yesterday. To have good sound quality and eliminate background noise, we've muted the phone lines. You can't hear us, but we can't hear you, but you can hear us. That doesn't mean you can't ask questions, though. We want you to do that, and the way to do it is to use the chat box on your panel. Only the moderators will see your chat, so don't hesitate to chat us any questions at any time. We will be pausing at a couple points to review the chats, but we encourage you to kind of ask your questions as they arise, and we'll also leave time at the end for additional questions that you didn't get a chance to ask. After the call, I'll be sending a follow-up email that'll have a link to watch the webinar recording on your YouTube channel. So you will be able to see on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch our entire recording. I also sent out a link to our PowerPoint and a couple of handouts that were provided that I'll send again at the end. So that takes care of the housekeeping items. For those of you who are new to MCN, we support individual nonprofits and the sector at large to be their own voice in the public policy process. We do that through advocacy and lobbying trainings. We serve as a resource to policymakers on our sector. We advocate on issues that impact the sector at large, things like incentives for charitable giving, nonprofit tax exemptions, lobbying rights, and so forth. As I said, this is the third installment in our series. Next month, we're going to do advocating through the media, and in May, we will have the topic of working with members of Congress. So please register online for any and all of these. They're all free sessions. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our presenters, Jeannie Fox and Nan Madden. Jeannie is Deputy Director of Public Policy here at MCN. She's responsible for direct and grassroots lobbying and advocacy efforts on behalf of the sector, and is a frequent speaker and trainer on various nonprofit advocacy topics, training them to increase their capacity to do advocacy and civic engagement work. Nan Madden has been the director of the Minnesota Budget Project since 1999. The Budget Project is an initiative of MCN that provides independent research, analysis, and advocacy on budget and tax issues, emphasizing the impact on low and moderate income persons and the organizations that serve them. Nan has authored numerous publications on fiscal issues as well as economic self-sufficiency. And in 2006, she was named by Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal as one of its 40 under 40 honorees. So Jeannie and Nan, thanks for joining us today. And Jeannie, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. We're happy to have you join us. For those of you in Minnesota, the legislature is in recess. So it gives us a few moments anyway to pause and reflect on our advocacy efforts. We have a very knowledgeable speaker today, Nan Madden, in talking about the Minnesota state budget process. So the three areas we're really going to try and cover is what's the big overview, the calendar, the steps in the process for what the state is charged with doing, setting a budget. We'll examine in quite some detail the current proposal. So we'll look at what the governor has suggested as well as how the legislature is responding to that. And then Nan's got some good resources lined up for us for you to continue to advocate for your cause the rest of the session and beyond. So let's get right to it. Let me turn it over to you, Nan. What is Minnesota's budget landscape?
Thanks, Jeannie. So it's a good time to be looking at the budget landscape because one of the main things that policymakers must get done this legislative session is passing the budget for the next 2-year biennium that starts on July 1st of this year. And the state's constitution does require us to pass a balanced budget. So knowing what the budget looks like is helpful in knowing what that task is. So first of all, for the budget cycle we're in right now, the 2012-13 biennium, the most recent budget numbers were good news. We actually are running a positive balance of $295 million. And by law, that will be used primarily to reverse a portion of the school funding shift that's been used in recent years to balance the budget in the short term. Also, a little bit goes into our state budget reserve. But where the problems lie is going forward. So I mentioned that this year is the year they need to set the budget for the next 2-year budget cycle. That's formally called fiscal 2014-15. And we're facing a $627 million deficit in that budget cycle. If we included the impact of inflation, because of course it does, year after year, inflation does mean it costs more to provide the same level of service, that deficit would grow to $1.5 billion. And it doesn't also include what it would take to fully pay back those school funding shifts, which is something a little over $800 million. And I think many folks would argue it also doesn't fully reflect what's needed in our communities after decades of budget struggles. If we look then out another 2 years to 16-17, the forecast finds a positive balance again, but if we include the impact of inflation, we find it measures about $1.5 billion of deficit when we include that impact of inflation.
Nan, you've mentioned some projections here. We're facing a deficit. Where do these numbers come from? How do we know?
So where these numbers come from, they come from the forecast. The state's economic forecast, sometimes called the budget forecast, is put together by Minnesota Management and Budget, which is a state agency. They do it twice a year, in November and in February. And the way they do these budget projections is it's helpful to kind of think about it as if we didn't change anything, what would happen? So they look at what's our current system of raising revenues, what our current levels of spending look like, and then also use a projection of what we think the economy is going to do, because these numbers are affected by economic conditions. And they say, so if we just kept everything the same and look out to the future, how much would the state expect to collect in revenue? How much would we spend? And do those numbers match up? They do adjust expected revenues for inflation, but as I mentioned, we don't adjust projected spending in most areas for the impact of inflation due to a decision made by the legislature in 2002.
Nan, 2 questions coming in. One, how accurate do these budget forecasts tend to be? And then 2, just someone's wondering, well, how can we have a positive balance now? The next we'll have a deficit, and then we'll have a positive balance again.
Sure. I'm going to write those down so I make sure I get them both in. On the accuracy, doing these forecasts, it's art and a science, because what it is projecting out into the future, so no one has a crystal ball and knows exactly what's going to happen. But the state uses a large macroeconomic consulting firm to help project those numbers going forward. And I would say also that this process is overseen by the state economist, who is not a political appointee. These numbers are put together by kind of nonpartisan finance professionals. But it has been harder over recent years to guess what the economy is going to do. We face some pretty unusual circumstances. Also, they have to, in these estimates, project a little bit about what Congress is going to do, and that also has gotten a little more difficult recently. The reason we go from positive to negative, so 12-13, that budget has already been set. That is the budget that got passed in 2011 after the shutdown. And things have been going a little bit better than expected when we passed that budget. So revenues come in a little bit above projections. Expenditures have been lower than we expected. So that creates a positive balance. But a number of the things that we did to balance the budget for 12-13 were one-time measures. So they solved the problem in the short term, but they don't have an ongoing impact. So we do have what's sometimes called a structural deficit, where in an ongoing way, we haven't found a sustainable way to fund our spending commitments. And then
but once we get to 2016, then things look a little better. So
they do, and that is reflecting the expected continued economic turnaround.
Great.
Well, given that, Nan, what do you see as being the key tax policy questions for policymakers this year?
So two things. One, again, kind of keying off what we've just talked about, our current tax system is not raising enough revenue to prevent us from being in a cycle of budget deficits. But also a concern for many policymakers is that the responsibility for funding public services is not shared as evenly as it could be. We're very fortunate in Minnesota. We probably know more about how we share the responsibility for funding public services than in any other state, because the research folks over at the Minnesota Department of Revenue put out a very comprehensive study every 2 years called the Tax Incidence Study, which seeks to understand how much of their incomes Minnesotans of each income level pay in state and local taxes. So I have a chart for folks to look at. This is state and local taxes together and what share of income Minnesotans pay. So one thing that you'll notice is that while Minnesotans on average pay 11.5% of their incomes in state and local taxes, in a rough way, as your income goes up, that percentage goes down. And you see the 1% of Minnesotans with the highest incomes actually pay 9.6% of their incomes in state and local taxes. And kind of closing that gap or narrowing that gap has been a priority, certainly for Governor Dayton, but I think also for a number of members of the legislature, and certainly for us here at the Minnesota Budget Project. This gap between what the highest income people are paying in state and local taxes and what everyone else pays has been growing over time. And in tax lingo, we say that our tax system is becoming more regressive. Another part of the picture that I think is going to be really relevant to the debate is that the way that people pay their taxes varies with income. So if you have kind of lower income, the sales tax is actually the largest part of your tax bill. In the middle incomes, the property tax tends to be the largest piece, and then on the high end, the income tax is the main tax. So I think we'll have a lot of discussion this year about how much should we be relying on these various tax types and what are the implications for tax fairness or the distribution.
Okay. We'll talk about what's being proposed shortly here, but can you give us a general picture, Nan, of how much the state spends, say, on schools, road, nursing homes, other public services?
Sure. The chart we're going to look at is for the budget cycle we're in right now for 12-13, and it is looking at the state's general fund. The state does organize its finances into various funds, and the general fund represents roughly 53% of that total, and that's where most of the action is at the legislature. That deficit, those surplus and deficit numbers I described actually are referring to the general fund. It's about $34 billion over a 2-year cycle, and the largest area of spending is K-12 education, followed by health and human services. And while health and human services get equal billing in that title, that is largely the area of health care. Third largest category, which has the geeky name of property tax aids and credits, that includes general state funding to cities and counties. That's often just called local government aid, but it also includes state-paid property taxes to individuals, more commonly known as the circuit breaker and the renter's credit. Those fall into that area. And then number 4 is higher ed. So if you actually take those 4 largest categories all together, that makes up 89% of the state's general fund budget, with everything else being a lot smaller. If we bring in the other funds and the other funding sources, so the state also has federal funding, we also have some dedicated funding sources, that slide looks a little different. You'll see that Health and Human Services and K-12 education switch places, reflecting the fact that we use a lot of federal dollars to pay for health care as well as dedicated funding sources. And transportation jumps to the third largest category. That again reflects the fact that transportation uses federal dollars but also is largely funded by dedicated funding sources. So in some ways it doesn't really compete with other areas of the budget for funding in the general fund.
So in these charts, Nan, I can see, several categories, things we all care about, like schools and roads and other functions of government. How do we pay for these things?
So the largest, the primary way we raise money for the general fund is through the state tax system. And you'll see the individual income tax makes up close to half of that total, followed by the sales tax. Sometimes people are wondering where is the property tax, the third of the big three taxes in the state. But the property tax is largely a local funding source, and what I'm showing you here is state funding into the general fund. There is a smaller property tax paid to the state by businesses and cabins. That's the orange wedge here called the statewide property tax. But largely the property tax is more at the local level.
Nan, I want to back up to the previous slide. We had a couple of questions.
Sure.
Actually, both about the Health and Human Services sector. One is why group those together if they're two separate agencies, and the other is just some details on what composes, what is the Health and Human Services portion really?
Sure. So these are, why group them together? It's a common way, sometimes we call these functional areas of the budget. This also has tended to be how the budget committees, so not every state agencies don't each all have their own committee, and in fact there's a number of small state agencies that get lumped into this state government category that includes things like the Department of Revenue, Management and Budget, admin, things like that. So Health and Human Services, that includes nursing homes, health care, services for people with disabilities. It also includes work supports for low-income people, welfare to work programs, that's much smaller. And I will have to admit I'm not totally sure in this set of categories. I believe affordable housing would also fall into this area, but this is where, depending on your issue area, it's worth doing some digging about. For example, if you're interested in housing, in the House, they have their own housing committee. It's not wrapped up in Health and Human Services, but on the Senate, I believe it's included in the Economic Development Committee. So it's worth doing a little bit of digging that these categories sometimes are defined slightly differently in different areas.
Great.
So Nan, who gets to decide? I mean, there are decisions here about how to collect money, how much to collect, who gets to decide how to spend it. How does that work?
So I think it's helpful to think about the budget process in two pieces. One is the development of the governor's budget, and then the second piece is the legislative budget process. And the way things work in Minnesota, the governor gets the first opportunity to propose a detailed budget, but the budget, for it to pass, actually needs to be passed in a series of bills that are passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. So the first piece, the governor's budget, so actually the proposal that the governor has put on the table for this year and we're discussing now, that process got started last summer when Minnesota Management and Budget, who facilitate this process, gave state agencies instructions about the process and timeline to put the budget together, and also what are the governor's priorities. So through the fall and winter of last year, state agencies work with MMB and the governor's office to develop the governor's budget proposal. That came out on January 22nd, and it's a very large, detailed, comprehensive document that outlines the governor's funding plans for all the areas of state budget for the upcoming biennium. And it needs to correspond to the budget numbers in the November forecast. It has to be balanced. So if there's a deficit, the governor needs to propose how it's going to close that up. If he wants to spend additional money than the forecast says is available, he has to say how he will raise that. So then when the February forecast comes out, after that they make some adjustments to that proposed budget. Those adjustments are often called the supplemental budget. And those include two kinds of changes. One, there are some proposals that just kind of get an updated price tag. So, for example, general school funding is calculated based on a number of students. If the February forecast has an updated number of students, they just redo the math for what that would cost. But then also the governor can make any other needed adjustments for so that the total size of his budget fits the new deficit or surplus number. So, for example, this year, since the deficit got a little smaller, the governor proposed a few new spending initiatives because he now had room to do that.
And then we have a question about this timeline here. So many of us are used to hanging out the Capitol or communicating with our legislators in some way once session is in process. But how can folks influence the process or make their desires known during that summer-winter time frame? Is there any opportunities there in the development?
I mean, that is one where it happens less out in the open and there's less public process to follow, but certainly having influence in the governor's budget gives you a big step forward. So some of the things that you can do are, for example, I work in the tax area, so we and a number of our colleagues got together, thought about what were our priorities, what we'd like to see in the governor's budget, and then made an appointment and went and talked to the commissioner of revenue and some of his top policy people and said, here are things we'd recommend you think about for the governor's budget. But it is one where you need to kind of create your opportunity. It's less of a process like committee hearings where a date and time is set. But there are ways to do that.
And, Nan, would you also suggest trying to meet with policy aides in the governor's office, not at the department level?
Yes, I think also discussing with the governor's office as well.
Okay. Well, why don't you, let's move on, and why don't you tell us exactly what is the governor proposing?
Sure. And I'll do kind of a broad brush here. We have more information on our blog if people want to dig into it some more. But at the kind of top line level, the governor's budget proposal includes a plan for raising revenues in order to address the budget deficit, but also to make some new investments. And those investments particularly are in early childhood education, increasing access to quality early education experiences, all-day kindergarten, some other proposals in the education area focused on the achievement gap, also investments in higher ed and a commitment to financial aid, for example, but also investments in economic development and public safety. In order to do that, he has a tax reform plan, both to address the adequacy of our tax system, but also some of those distribution challenges we talked about earlier to make the system more fair. Some of the pieces in his tax reform plan, which people may be familiar with, fourth-tier income tax on the Minnesotans with the 2% of Minnesotans with the highest income. That's the largest piece of his tax plan. Also would raise cigarette taxes by 94 cents a pack. He would end some tax preferences that exist currently in the corporate franchise tax. In order to push back on some of the property tax pressures we've seen, he has $120 million more in aids to cities and counties. Also, an $18 million increase in the property tax refund for renters, also known as the renter's credit, which was cut in 2011. And then a local revenue source he proposes is increasing a local sales tax for transit in the metro area. A couple of pieces that were part of his tax plan that were taken out in the supplemental was he had a much broader sales tax proposal that he took off the table, but then he also didn't have as much revenue as originally proposed, so he also took out a proposed $500 property tax rebate for homeowners.
Nan, I'm going to ask a question here that we got that maybe puts some of this in context, and it's relating to the tax reform and the revenue side. I'm actually going to bring us back to the chart showing our revenue pie. So I imagine in a lot of states the spending side is similar in that I'm guessing things like education, health and human services usually take up the largest chunk. Well, what about on the revenue side? And the question is, we hear a lot that Minnesota is a high tax state. In what ways is that revenue pie chart here different from other states because we are a high tax state? So I'll let you tackle that question.
Sure. And actually, I would challenge the assertion that we're a high tax state. In some ways, we've dropped on a number of those measures. But also in a broader way, I think it's important to note that how this pie chart is distributed also relates to what does that pattern look like of that other chart about distribution across income levels. Many states do rely more on the sales tax and more on property taxes and less on a progressive income tax, and then you see a situation where the fact that low and middle income people pay more than on the high income is more dramatic than what we see in Minnesota. Another thing that's somewhat different from other states and varies quite a bit from state to state is how much is funded at the state level and how much is funded at the local level. And Minnesota has been a state that has tended to fund education, a larger share of education at the state level rather than at the local level, which is also an attempt to make sure that there's some sense of equal quality of education across the state. States that tend to do it more at just the property tax level, at the local level, do it more off the property tax, and then you see a wider disparity among states.
Great. We have a question about the corporate tax. So on this pie, you see the corporate income tax is 5%. The question is about Governor Dayton's proposal here. And could you explain a little bit about the corporate tax preferences? And actually, the question says that he's surprised that there's so little revenue that comes from that source of ending corporate tax preferences. So what's behind that?
Well, the corporate tax is not a super big piece of our overall tax pie. The specific preferences, I believe there are 5 or 6. But the 2 largest are called FOC and foreign royalty subtraction, and they have to do with corporations that have certain overseas activities. And they've been a focus for a number of years about whether that's a good feature to have in the tax system. The governor's original tax proposal also paired those ending those preferences with a rate reduction, so it was more of a revenue neutral proposal. But when they took out some of these sales tax provisions, there no longer was the revenue to do that. So now he's focusing on ending those tax preferences. And part of the argument that the governor makes is that those are provisions that only some companies benefit from, and so in some ways everyone else who doesn't get a benefit pays more because of that.
Okay, so Nan, the governor's kind of signaled what his preferences are. How does this play out in the legislature?
So the legislature's process is very different from the governor's process. So the governor's process, as indicated by that question about how to influence, is a little more behind the scenes, but then it comes out with a very detailed product that has, you know, the big numbers and all the details all at once. It's a very concrete product. The legislative process happens a little more in public, but it also is more organic. And there is not a thing that is the budget, but rather the budget is made up of an education budget bill, a health and human services budget bill, a tax bill, an environmental budget bill. Adding all of those things together make up the budget, and they're all kind of being put together about the same time. They start out by each of the finance committees hearing what's proposed in the governor's budget as kind of a starting point, but then they also use what's called budget resolutions and targets to kind of create some structure and a framework as they're putting together those various budget bills. The budget resolution and the targets set out kind of what's the total size of the general fund spending pie, and then the targets say how much each committee has to work with. They aren't laws, they're rules. The House and Senate will create different targets. They don't have to be the same, but they say how much each finance committee has to spend or cut, and they're usually expressed as the amount of change from the base budget. So, for example, if the Education Committee had a $100 million target, that would mean that the Education Committee could spend $100 million on new initiatives on top of kind of baseline spending. If they had a negative target, that would be how much they would need to cut. They're working on putting those bills together, and we've just seen those targets. But they'll be working towards getting those bills done by the end of session.
So, Nan, how much of this, just to put this all in context, we've had this process where, you know, every 2 years we set the budget, and it starts with the governor, and then there's these different kind of revenue forecasts, and then the committees work. How much of this is the same from year to year, and is the process basically always the same? Does it vary a little bit?
The process is pretty similar. What varies is, so the governor's budget always comes out in January, except for the first year of a new administration, then it comes out in February. The forecasts are always called November and February, although sometimes the November forecast comes out the first week of December. My general sense is that the targets came out a little early this year, but it's about this time. The legislature can choose to define their committees how they want, and so sometimes there's some moving around, like this Housing Finance Committee is new this year. But the general parameters are pretty similar, and the overall process is similar. It's more kind of exactly how things are defined and the exact date that things happen that varies.
So, Nan, given we're halfway through Governor Dayton's term, he would have inherited his first budget from the previous governor, Governor Pawlenty. What's significant about that? It seems like this would be a signature budget then for the governor. Can you talk about the politics of that a little bit?
Yeah, that's right. When you're having an election, so remember I said the process for developing the governor's budget starts in the summer. That's true even if there's an election in November, in which case the state agencies probably do a little bit more of developing different scenarios, but it's true that it's only the second budget of an administration that really reflects that governor's work from start to finish. So while certainly Governor Dayton did have some of his major priorities reflected in the first budget he put together, this budget that we're looking at this year is the first time that it's a complete work product from start to finish from this administration.
We got another question. I'm actually going to bring up the next slide because the question is about these committee targets
Mhm.
and so before you now is the House budget targets.
Yeah.
How is this coordinated? So, what do we know about, does the leadership, for instance, say, we're going to spend X amount of dollars and leave it to the committee chairs to fight it out? Isn't each committee chair trying to get as much as possible? How much independence do they have? So, and I'm sure that varies depending on who's meeting. But what do we know about that process?
Good question. And maybe I'll kind of back up a little bit and say kind of broadly what the targets represent, and then I'll hit those questions. So we did see the targets March 19th and 20th from the House and Senate. There are many similarities, both as kind of follow the pattern the governor set. They raise enough revenues to address the deficit and make some new investments. They both have said they would include something like the governor's fourth-tier tax proposal. The House also talking about a temporary surcharge to pay off the school funding shift. Both House and Senate devote more than half of their new investments to E-12 and higher ed. Both also have a big focus on the property tax with substantial targets for aids to local governments and property tax refunds. Both have more than $200 million more distributed among other areas. But I think the one that is most alarming to us and I think the most surprising to folks, and it kind of ties into your question of how these are developed, is there's a negative $150 million target for Health and Human Services that they would have to meet by either cutting services, raising revenues in the area of their jurisdiction, so that would not be a general tax increase, or a transfer from another fund. And I think it does vary from year to year. It's not a public process how the leadership develop these targets. Certainly, we imagine that all chairs are arguing for the best target they can have and are talking about what kind of money is needed to do what they need to do. It's important to remember the targets are a beginning part of the process, so there may be some amount of doing the math of saying we know we want to do X, Y, and Z, and that costs this much, but it's not like the whole budget has been determined and they've figured out it costs this much to do these things. It's a target, and the details are to be worked out later. They certainly can be talking with members in the caucus, but there were some things in the paper. For example, the House Health and Human Services chair seemed quite surprised by this target. So it doesn't sound like, in this case, there was a lot of negotiation to come to agreement. But it is something that happens kind of behind the scenes, so it's hard to know exactly how they're set, which is always the case from year to year, that it's not a particularly transparent process of how it is being set.
Well, we have a question to that end here coming in, Nan. Since all bills are created independent of each other, does this drive up the budget since everyone's only focused on their own area rather than the budget as a whole?
Well, that's kind of the point of the targets, is that there is agreement, at least by the leadership, of how big the pie will be. And, we have to have a balanced budget. So if you want to spend the money, you have to be willing to raise the money as well, and that does provide a break on things. It does allow some amount of specialization by you breaking it into committees, but it does whether it drives up the budget, this process in and of itself, I don't know that is the case, especially since it's not each committee doesn't get to pick their target. They can make their case, but the leadership has to decide how it all fits together, and frankly, those budget targets are also what prevent the committee from spending more than this, or from members on the floor trying to add amendments to these bills that would spend above this target. These are rules. You cannot spend more than the target allows.
Okay, and let's move to the Senate budget target slide. So even though, they're controlled by the same party, Nan, it doesn't look like the Senate and House agree on everything.
No, and some of this, too, this gets back to that question of someone asked, what is included in this category. The reason why I put these on two different pages and didn't just kind of make a kind of three-way table, House, Senate, Governor, is, these are targets for these committees, so they have to define these areas the way their committees do it, which is not exactly the same between House and Senate, although there's a lot of overlap. But it does give you a sense of both bodies did set kind of the same couple of things as their top priorities, but they do have some differences as well, and that also is something then that they'll have to figure out later. I mentioned, so each one of these budget committees needs to pass a budget bill. They have their own target. So the House Education Bill won't be exactly the same as the Senate Education Bill, and they will then at a later point, kind of late April and May, they'll meet in a conference committee where they're going to need to come to a compromise, and that is a place when the Senate and House leadership will need to come together and set new targets, where they've decided, they'll define these things in exactly the same way, and they'll have a common target that they're working forward on.
Let's go back to that legislative budget process slide, because you're describing there kind of this flow.
Yep.
And how much, looking at the targets, how much do you think these bills are going to reflect what the governor had wanted? And does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a starting point. And the broad priorities seem to match up fairly similarly with the governor's, with the exception of Health and Human Services among the large areas. They really do work off of the governor's budget as kind of their starting point, but then they have their own ideas and priorities as well. You mentioned the legislature is on break this week, but when they come back next week, they're really going to start heating up the process to develop those omnibus budget bills, because those need to pass by April 19th out of committee. And then, as I mentioned, they're going to need to work in these House and Senate conference committees to develop a compromise between the two. And often it is the case that the governor's administration is part of those negotiations as well, to influence what those final bills look like.
And let me just clarify, Nan, the conference committee would be made up of members of both the House and Senate then?
Yep, that's right. So a budget conference committee normally has 5 Senate members and 5 House members, the chair of the committee, other folks on the committee, and they're all made up of people from that finance committee. The leadership gets to select who they are, and so they can choose whether they'll be members of the minority party. And it's a convention that in order to be on the conference committee, you need to vote for the bill when it has its floor vote. So we saw that on one of the health care bills that moved earlier in the session, where Representative Abler voted for the bill in order to be able to go on the conference committee, although he didn't ultimately support that bill. When those budget bills go to the governor, once they've passed through the committee process, they've passed off the floor of the House and the Senate, and it hits the governor's desk, then the governor has 3 things that he can do. He can sign that budget bill, and then we have a budget in place for that area of the budget, and that can start on July 1st. He can veto the entire bill, send it back to the legislature to do some more work on it. Or he can line item veto individual spending items, but only spending items can be line item vetoed. For example, a governor cannot line item veto a policy provision. So if there's a bill that has a lot of things in it, including some policies that he doesn't like, he does need to veto that whole bill and send it back. So that is a reason why an administration will get involved in these negotiations as they're crafting these bills, because in this kind of situation, they would prefer to have a bill that they want to sign rather than having to veto and send it back.
And Nan, for those of us who've been around a while, watching this process, 2 times in the last decade, Minnesota has entered into a government shutdown. Is that a scenario you could see happening this particular year?
I don't see that happening this year, but let's talk a little bit about what makes that happen. So, with this timeline, these budget bills need to get passed because the budget year starts on July 1st. We have had it happen 2 years now where not all of the budget bills were passed. In the earlier time, I'm trying to remember when that was, in the mid-2000s, we had 3 bills, I believe, that hadn't been passed yet. So some parts of the budget were in place and others were not. The more recent example, I believe none of the bills were passed.
And then the ones that are passed, do they get enacted right away?
Yep, they get enacted right away. You know, again, this idea that the budget isn't one thing, but really the cumulative adding up of these budget bills. And the reason why we have a shutdown and why we have so much confusion and uncertainty when we have a shutdown is in Minnesota there's not very much clearly defined authority to spend money if the budget is not in place. I think in other states there's more authority to kind of do something more like a continuing resolution, or the administration has a little more leeway to kind of keep things up and running. But in Minnesota, in the absence of that, you know, that's where we have kind of a court process gets set up and says, well, the Constitution says government must provide for the safety and welfare of its citizens, something along those lines, and then a judge needs to say, well, does this particular service meet that threshold or not? But I think when we've had those shutdowns, there's been a really big difference of opinion about the priorities and the direction the state needed to go in, and kind of led to a stalemate and the budget not getting done on time, whereas this year there's a broader area of agreement about general priorities and principles, and there are very important details to be worked out, but I think that'll get done on time.
And if you were listening there, you probably, I think Nan just kind of gave us a review of the 9th grade civics lessons, right? Here's the Schoolhouse Rock commercial. We've got 3 branches of government, and in those shutdown scenarios, that probably best displays that checks and balances, where you have a legislature that is charged with setting a budget. In the cases of 2005 and 2010 that Nan mentioned, they weren't able to do it. Enter the executive branch, which the governor has the authority to call the legislature back to session but cannot set the agenda, so they don't do that lightly. And then, of course, in the most severe case where agreement can't be reached, the judicial branch gets involved and actually decides what services would be considered essential and would continue to be funded during the stalemate. I think we have another question.
Yeah, I'm going to bring us to the targets page. And the question is about how we as a collective sector, nonprofit sector, might want to approach this. So, I can see from people who are on the training, we have people from, for instance, organizations who provide services to people with disabilities. We have people who work on ending homelessness. We have people who are in healthcare. And you can see that at the end of the day, there's a finite number to our budget, and and that there, in a sense, there's winners and losers, right? If we put more in transportation, we're going to have to take out, or at least, that's one scenario, right? Take out from somewhere else. So how do we as a sector approach this? Because I don't think our communities come ahead if we're just trading off programs that are essential one for the other. How do we get out of that?
Yeah. I think that's really, I think as groups and organizations kind of move their advocacy into kind of deepening levels of advocacy. Often we start advocating for our program after the target's already been set, and that's a really that's not always a very fun process, because the target's already been set, and then you see, it's child care versus nursing homes versus services for people with disabilities. So, moving one step out from that is, how do you influence the target for health and human services? And then one step further back from that is, how do you influence the size of the pie overall? So a lot of organizations, and this is something at the Budget Project we've spent a lot of time on, have been involved in the work to make the case that the way to address the deficit should not be only through cuts, but also through raising revenues, and we need to raise enough revenues so that we can meet the needs of the state. Not that we raise an infinite amount of revenues, but that we needed some more than what we had, and we think the targets in a broad way do represent those priorities, and a work a lot of groups have done to say, after 10 years of deficits and cuts, we needed to go in another direction. It is the case that these targets, it doesn't happen often, but the targets can be changed by leadership. So I think that is something that a number of groups are thinking about right now, is the advocacy work to try to come up with ways to meet that target that would be the least painful, or is it a way of saying we think that target should change, and in which case, are you going to kind of go in the area of saying that then more revenues need to be put into this picture so that there isn't a $150 million cut target for Health and Human Services. And I think that's something that groups in that interested in Health and Human Services are really taking a look at. And I've seen a number of organizations making that case to leadership to rethink that target and to really be articulating to them. Because remember, you don't do the whole budget and then find out what the target is. You figure out the targets and fill in the details. So it's a really important time for people to be saying, we don't see how you meet that target without, here's the impact on the services we care about if it's done all through cuts. So I think really articulating that picture for leadership and for other kind of legislative champions is important.
So Nan, few of us are able to watch this process at the level you are, and most days I think we're probably all glad for that. But can you give us an idea, like how can average advocate here kind of stay on top of things, and what are some of the resources to help do that?
Sure. So some of the things that we like to do and really focus on at the Minnesota Budget Project is we know that many people and organizations are advocating on their own issues, and we want to provide some broader context so you can place your advocacy in that overall budget context. So we are blogging quite a bit at our blog, Minnesota Budget Bites, on what's in the targets, what's in the governor's budget. So that can be a good way for people who, you probably are pretty up to speed on your own issue area, but haven't had time to learn about what's the big picture and what's happening in other areas. So that's a good place to keep up to date. Another thing we've put together, the Advocates Fiscal Toolbox, is a resource that puts together all in one place many of the resources that I've talked about over the last hour. It's got a link to the governor's budget. It's got a link to the forecast. It's got a link to the tax incident study. It has a link to where you can find the fiscal notes, and you can also find that on our website. But I think often groups, they know their own issue area very well. They know what's needed in that area, but then want to kind of move into this work of making the case for the funding side of things and raising revenues. I put up a handout for where we have more information on the tax system that includes some of the arguments and data I talked about today, but also some more. We call that the Facts Still Speak. And then also, people can also contact us at the Budget Project if there's, kind of technical assistance questions. Where do we find this information? Where do we find out how it's defined? And we try to handle as many of those as we can during the legislative session as well. And you'll see my contact information there.
And Nan, I'm guessing if some people want to look at some of the original source documents, I think you have links to the Minnesota Management and Budget website as well in your blog? Yep,
all of that's in that fiscal toolbox where you can find the original. We have a link to Management and Budget. We have links to the forecast and the budget materials as well.
If you'll just chat any final questions you have, we're going to wrap up in a minute. And if you do, and while you do that, I have one just brief question for Nan. So we've talked about where the process is at now. Could you just walk us through the next kind of year and a half? So, for instance, what happens next year?
Sure. Good question. So what happens next year? So in the odd-numbered sessions, they really focus on passing this 2-year budget. In the even-numbered year, they tend to focus more on the bonding bill, the capital budget, but they do normally put together what confusingly is also called the supplemental budget. So I talked about kind of the update to the governor's proposed budget that comes out in March being called the supplemental. Next year, there will also be a supplemental budget proposal, which takes the budget that's in place and just makes any adjustments to it. So we don't have to pass the whole budget again. But the process for developing that is similar, but kind of a scaled down version of what we described. So over the summer and fall, the administration putting together their budget proposals. It's usually pretty limited. They don't want to rehash the whole thing, but emerging issues, new initiatives, and then you'll follow a similar process through the legislature, but at a much smaller scale, because any budget decisions being made are just adjusting the budget that's in place, not needing to pass the overall baseline budget.
Thank you, Nan. Let's take a minute just to say thanks for sharing this information. I know for those of you on the line, it sounds complex. It is complex, but there are a lot of resources there, the Minnesota Budget Project website and others, and we want to encourage you to take part in some of our other upcoming webinars. Jeff?
That's right. Our next training will be next month on advocating through the media, and the month after that we'll be working with members of Congress. So please continue to use this as a resource. We really want to hear from you. If you have specific questions, that's really what we're here for. So please be in touch as needed. Again, I'll be sending out the recording that you can refer back to along with resources. So we're going to wrap it up here. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you on a future training. Have a great day.